And, well, several political science scholars, like Professor Makihara, who appeared in the Asahi Shimbun's comment section, and I believe another professor as well, were arguing that while some say the centrist movement is dead, it's actually the CDP that is finished. And the fact is, they have absolutely no support among the youth. They are making the point that the idea that you can win a future by opposing constitutional reform and nuclear power is just too detached from reality. Well, the centrist reform coalition, you could say it's a dead brand, or that it's been branded as a loser, and I think that's pretty fatal. Overturning that is impossible, or rather, the public likes to back a winner, so once you're seen as a loser, it's really tough. I mean, they did get around 10 million votes, which is probably why it's so hard to dismantle them. They got a fair amount, but they've already been slapped with that loser label, haven't they? Yeah, like they're a dead cause. That label really stuck to them more than the constitutional Democrats, and I think the party itself feels finished. Maybe it's because they didn't get as many votes as they expected, which lowered their perceived value. Yeah. Personally, when the centrist reform coalition was formed, I thought it was a fine idea as one option. Honestly, my view hasn't changed, even though some of my viewers probably think they shouldn't have formed it at all. Yeah. I mean, if you like liberals, maybe you like someone like Harumi Yoshida or Yukio Adano, but it wasn't like they had a choice to run under those names. Policy-wise, it was really just Yoshihiko Noda's CDP or the Noda Saito Centrist Reform Coalition. So, in conclusion, if those were the only two options, I don't think betting on the centrist reform coalition was a bad move. Either way, they were headed for ruin. Even before the election had even begun. Well, seeing people like him or Mr. Noda acting like they're running away after the election is just pathetic, but honestly, anyone can see they can't capture the unaffiliated voters or the younger demographic, so the only real idea was to try and form a cross-organizational party. So, I mean, there might be arguments that because of Komeito votes, for instance, the Constitutional Democratic Party's support base or unaffiliated voters drifted away. That's why I'm quite skeptical about whether things would have turned out significantly differently if they had gone with a centrist Noda versus a constitutional Democratic Noda. Yeah. Well, either way, I think both were misses. It was kind of like a sweepstakes with no winning tickets. From that perspective, the unfortunate result of creating this centrist bloc was, frankly, that they lost so badly that the proportional seats were mostly filled by Komeito candidates, so the constitutional Democratic lawmakers were essentially wiped out, except for those who won in single-seat districts. So, I mean, when watching parliamentary debates and such, I think there are people who feel it's a real shame. Well, that might be true, but from the start, they didn't intend to lose that badly, and I don't think anyone really expected them to lose that much, right? I mean, the opponent was just too strong, wasn't it? For starters, they won the most seats in history, right? They took them outright, didn't they? And well, in the polling before the election even started, they were already being talked about for an absolute majority, so it was a tough situation, but as the days went by, the centrist reform movement couldn't win over the unaffiliated, and a trend emerged where, if anything, the unaffiliated were leaning toward the LDP, which is the opposite of the usual pattern. The Komeito party usually acts as a buffer for the LDP, but since that didn't happen this time, I think that's why they faced a defeat unlike anything they've seen before. So, I want to state that this channel's stance is that we don't really buy the argument that they would have been saved if they had just leaned one way or the other. Some scholars argue that the Constitutional Democratic Party is a lost cause, so they have no choice but to try harder with a centrist approach, but I don't think that's right either. For instance, look at what Professor Hara and others have to say. Actually, there's a topic I've been interested in lately, to the point where I'd like to document it as a project, and that is that Article 9 isn't actually that unpopular. Some think it's unpopular because talking about changing it or protecting it is tied to the historical context of the Takaichi administration's rise, but that's not the case. Yes, the vast majority of people believe it's better not to change Article 9, and support for it has actually gone up since the Takaichi administration began. So, there's a theme I find interesting right now, and I'd like to share it with you again. We saw the birth of an administration that both domestic and international observers have labeled a Takaichi administration. But when you ask if the voters are shifting to the right, that's clearly not the case. In fact, many indicators suggest they might even be wary of her. For example, the support for female candidates is incredibly high, isn't it? I think even Takaichi and her allies are confused, because I suspect they genuinely thought the public was shifting to the right. But public opinion hasn't really shifted to the right. On the contrary, on issues like Article 9, female emperors, same-sex marriage, and even things like weapon exports, public opinion often aligns more closely with the arguments made by liberal parties. So, saying that Article 9 is outdated, that we shouldn't be obsessed with it, or that we should just abandon the Constitutional Democratic Party, I don't think that's right. I mean, maybe nuclear power is the same, but I think everyone hears about it. Around the time of the Great East Japan earthquake, there was a lot of interest for a while, but honestly, I doubt it's something that determines how most people vote these days. Perhaps there's a slight statistical difference in regions like Fukushima or Niigata where nuclear power feels more real, but I think for the majority, it's not really a level of concern. In that sense, I feel like a consumer-first mindset is widespread. Interestingly, regarding the Constitution, while people say they don't want to change Article 9, they're in favor of explicitly mentioning the self-defense forces, so it's hard to tell if they're right or left. The majority of public opinion doesn't really align with any one party's platform, does it? There's strong support for not changing it, but people also say it's better to explicitly mention the self-defense forces. Shall we take a quick look? Well, let's skip this part. I don't know if it's the absolute majority, but there are definitely more people for it than against it. It's strange because, on one hand, people are fine with mentioning the self-defense forces in Article 9, but if you suggest going any further than that, opposition tends to increase. Yeah. Look, when I hear Mr. Makihara say, I feel like I'm out of touch, and claim the only way is to go centrist, or that liberals are outdated and only appeal to the elderly, I think that's not necessarily true. If you look at the data, as we saw earlier, Article 9 actually has quite a lot of support. Yeah, so you can't just dismiss Article 9. It might be old-fashioned, but support for it has actually increased since the Abe administration began. Now, you might wonder why people support Sanae Takaichi, but that's just how public opinion goes sometimes. Yeah. My point is, whether or not everyone joins this centrist reform movement, it's going to be a rough road ahead regardless. And no matter which path they take, things are in such a hopeless state right now that you can't even catch a glimpse of a turnaround. On the other hand, to be honest, there isn't really a clear solution either. I think the Democratic Party for the People has proven that. They touted realistic security policies, and their approval ratings plummeted, right? It feels like they've basically reverted to where they were, hasn't it? I mean, lately, at their press conferences, they're just being completely ignored. Even when people like Mr. Shinba speak, it's not gaining any traction. It's like they've just faded into the background. As for Sanseido, it feels like the initial trendiness is fading, though they might still be strong simply because they have an actual organization. Well, their funding depends on party member contributions, so if that income drops, there's a real possibility they won't be able to keep operating. Yeah. So, that's where we stand. Yes. That's exactly it. And, speaking of that, There were public opinion polls around the anniversary of the end of the war, and the public really likes things like the 3 non-nuclear principles. It's over 70%, no matter where you poll. That hasn't become a minority opinion at all, right? And they are also against exporting weapons. That's definitely not a minority opinion either, is it? Actually, the patriots are the ones going crazy over this. And among some of those patriots, there are people who fall for conspiracies. For instance, when there's a lot of support for Empress Aiko or a female emperor, there are idiots claiming it's because of some sort of agitation. You can find them if you look online, and they write these long essays. I don't know if they had ChatGPT write them or what. But there are idiots who claim that, according to their analysis, it's the result of manipulation by the far right. But, Professor, watching this, I think you want to say that Article 9 shouldn't be treated like some kind of holy scripture. But as I said before, people actually quite like Article 9, yeah. So, I think it's a mistake to say that the Communist Party isn't popular because they make such a fuss about Article 9. And I don't think the Constitutional Democratic Party is unpopular just because they are fixated on Article 9 either. And so, this is my recent take on the matter, but I think one way to explain this so-called twisted or detached attitude is what is known as privatism. Privatism is something Alexis de Tocqueville discussed long ago in the context of individualism, but it's the idea that as one withdraws from the public sphere, they determine the good or evil of things based on their own personal interests or the degree to which things interfere with their private life. Well, there are, of course, various ways to interpret this, but when it comes to foreigners, people are conflicted. They want the labor force, but they're also worried about public safety. Both sentiments are high. You see this, not in my backyard, type of public opinion, which might look liberal or conservative, but I think it's just people wanting to be comfortable without interference in their private lives, while avoiding anything they perceive as a risk to that comfort. Regarding the Constitution and national security, while some might argue the interpretations are forced, take the dispatch of the self-defense forces to the Strait of Hormuz. There was quite a lot of opposition to that, wasn't there? That's because it was reported that there was a possibility that missiles could come flying back at us. They talked about the risk of being dragged into a conflict, or rather, the possibility of Japan getting involved in a war. I think it was the same thing during the security legislation debates. With things like nuclear power plants, people were highly sensitive when they felt it might affect their private lives, including the radiation issues, but I think everyone has just forgotten about it now. Yeah. So, while I don't think that explains everything, for example, regarding an empress, most people probably just think, it doesn't affect my private life, so why not? If someone then starts insisting, no, it must be male line succession at all costs, people just think that person is a bit extreme. Compared to 30 years ago, voters overall are said to have become quite liberal on issues like women's rights and homosexuality. There were surveys in the 90s where support for same-sex marriage wasn't even at 30%, but that's certainly not the case anymore, is it? So, well, it's not as if the voters are really being swayed by anything. Yeah. On the other hand, there aren't really any self-proclaimed left-wing or liberal types either. So, whether you call it a lack of interest or people who can only think in terms of an extension of their own private lives, it's a really difficult problem in today's world how to get those people to vote or participate in politics. As for why those people who can only think in terms of their own lives end up voting for people like Koichi or going to parties like Sanseitu, that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, but it's a tough one. There are actually many different interpretations of the problem. For instance, there's the argument that changing the government itself could hinder their personal lives. That's a conservative attitude in that sense. Yeah. There are many other patterns, but I haven't reached a conclusion yet. I do think there's something unique to Japan. Yeah. In other countries, parties labeled as left-wing or liberal are a bit stronger, whereas in Japan, you could say those options are basically non-existent or decimated. Even when they tried to present realistic security policies or middle-of-the-road approaches, I think they failed. Well, the centrist reform coalition didn't go well either, and you can't really say the Democratic Party for the People is thriving, either. The Japanese political system itself is built around the LDP, so that inherent difficulty is always there, I suppose. Well, for me personally, I'm not a campaign consultant or someone who can just walk into an election, so I can't really say how to win or know for sure, but I think betting on this centrist reform coalition was a final, desperate choice that had to be made. Of course, those directly affected by it might feel otherwise, but that's just how it looks from an outsider's perspective. I mean, they got about 1,000 in proportional representation and around 1,200 in the constituencies, right? And well, they got around 2,700, though they didn't win the Democratic seat count, they still got a decent amount. If you ask if that changed anything, even if they had gotten, say, 1,500, I think they still would have been wiped out. Yeah. If they had about 1,200, could they have overturned the situation in each race? It might have been slightly better than it is now, but at the time, they had 7 million more votes. That was when the Constitutional Democratic Party really pulled in the votes, or maybe during the money scandal, but even then they were below the LDP, so if they had gone in alone, it would have been tough against 2,700. That's what I think anyway. Yeah. There's even some debate over whether the Komeito votes actually aligned with the centrist platform at all. Yeah, but they did get around 1,000. They got about 1,200 in proportional representation, and people did show up to vote, so it might be questionable, but I don't think Komeito supporters were intentionally trying to make them lose. Well, this was during Mr. Takai's election, and the fact is, the DPFP and others lost votes compared to the 3 elections prior, didn't they? It just goes to show how strong Sanae Takaichi is, and how she managed to sweep up all those independent votes. In that sense, I think it's entirely possible that Constitutional Democratic Party supporters voted for someone like Takaichi-san. Well, from the perspective of the online space, that's just unacceptable, isn't it? But as I showed you before regarding the cabinet support series, about 40% of CDP supporters supported Takaichi-san. I thought Takaichi-san was losing a lot of votes, but when I looked, even about 25% of the Japanese Communist Party supporters were backing her. You might not see the Takaichi cabinet in the real world, but among voters, there are many in places we can't see, even among those calling themselves Liberal Party supporters, who are voting for her. So Takaichi-san's pulling power was actually quite strong. It was strong. For the primary source, look at this FNN poll. Support for Takaichi among JCP supporters more than doubled, and for the CDP, it was around 35 to 40%. For example, this Sankey article mentions a Kyodo News poll where 46.8% of CDP supporters favored Takaichi-san. It's hard to imagine that in reality, half of the people who vote for the CDP might think Takaichi-san is a good choice, right? But there are quite a lot of people like that. Yes. That's what makes the world so interesting. Well, not that it's any laughing matter. Regardless of which party you support, whether you support the Takaichi administration or criticize it, people who are deeply interested in politics online would probably think these people are crazy. I suppose it comes down to labor unions or Soka Gakkai influence, but I think the younger the generation, those not involved in such organizations, the stronger the life-first mentality. I think there are probably a lot of people nowadays who don't belong to any kind of community or anything like that. Well, I'm probably one of them, but I also think that everyone else's way is good, so it's just about going with the flow at the time. And if I look back on those times, I really didn't know what the Communist Party was advocating for to begin with. I didn't know what the Democratic Party was advocating for either. I mean, things like Article 9 of the Constitution, I had no clue. So, when I finally became a voter, it was right around the time the government changed, which is probably when I started being a voter. And when I consider the progression since then, things like the security legislation debates were on a level one didn't even know about. But for people like me, and I think there are many who are at that level, it might be slightly off topic, but when someone with no public involvement has to judge something, they only really have their own life stability to base it on. Yeah, that's why there are so many complaints about things like price hikes, and that's why cabinet approval ratings drop. This isn't just happening in Japan, it happens in the US too. People are obviously vulnerable to inflation, and when that kind of lifestyle struggle spreads, everything else feels irrelevant. If you confirm that progress toward making your private life comfortable is hitting a wall, you're obviously going to be unhappy. And this inflation thing, it's really difficult, isn't it? If there were a Superman who could fix it, it would probably be right to just follow their lead in an election, or to have them present an alternative plan, but in today's Japan, I don't know if that's possible, since the opposition parties aren't much different from the ruling party. They just keep coming up with extreme ideas that would only accelerate inflation, so I find it pretty tough. The issue of perceiving one's own private life as the entirety of the world, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been discussed by thinkers like Tocqueville and, going back further, Heidegger as well. He discussed this in his book, Being and Time, which I actually introduced in a newsletter some time ago. In that work, he addresses what it means to be, describing our modern ontological state as one where we can only perceive the world through a lens of utility. An instrumental perception of the world means that whether you're dealing with objects or meeting people, you can only think of everything as a means to an end, perhaps similar to asking if something is profitable or not. Heidegger argues that in the modern age, the only thing that can break this instrumental perception is an encounter that forces us to confront our own mortality. That's why people living near nuclear plants in Fukushima, or those in Okinawa facing issues like the base construction in Henoko, oppose them so strongly. It's because those issues have a tangible reality for them, cutting directly into their daily lives and becoming matters of survival. To those living far away, it feels like it doesn't matter, and the current conflicts over data center construction are exactly the same. For those living nearby,